Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 18 and complete the chapter and the long saga of the rebellion of Absalom in 2 Samuel 15 to 18. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we're going to cover this long scene that you can see in the chiastic box here with Ahimaaz and the Cushite both running to give King David the tidings. And one of the things we have to ask as we prepare to enter this scene is, we noted last video the story of Absalom's death and the end of the war and his burial all happens in just a couple of verses. The war happens in just the verse up here and another verse down here, and Absalom's death happens instantly almost, and then he's buried in a pit. But the question of just giving the message to David of what happens takes up 15 verses here from 18:19 to 33. And it carries a whole series of repeated words that are repeated many, many times. You can see running, both in the participle form here and otherwise, run, 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 as well as the mysterious presence of the Cushite, only referred to that way a whole series of times, and framed by the question of the hand of enemies we see up here and then down here. And Joab is involved in it at one end, and David and his sentinel and the gatekeeper are involved in it at the other end, but both involved with a question that has taken up our attention one way or another throughout our entire journey through this. And as we look at the interpretive options that we did in the beginning in the introductory video, I'd like to go over that again. So one of the questions here is, what is David's role in Absalom's death here? And as we noted at the beginning, one of the options, the one that many commentators just assume is the quote right answer, was Nathan's word from Yahweh in 2 Samuel 12, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. But as I've been noting, that continues explicitly to name the taking of your wives in the sight of this very son. And Absalom did that, but does Nathan's word imply that everything else that goes on is still Yahweh's will? As I've been noting, one of the questions should be, since over 20,000 people are said to have died in the war, could that be Yahweh's will to punish David so that 20,000 innocent people have to die? That doesn't seem likely. Another is that what we call the secular political view is that there's justice not being provided in the street. David isn't noticing it, and Absalom is. And Absalom offers justice to all Israel, and they come to his side, but he simply loses the battle. And it's simple as that. But another is the more subversive one, and it's perhaps a challenge if you think of David as a good guy. But so much in the text has shown that David is a murderer, and yet he covers it up or avoids responsibility repeatedly. After all, the slogan in the street that made Saul so angry about David rising to power was, Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And we've seen many reports of that, but in addition to the killing in war, the death of Abner and many others along the way. And as we know, as readers, will happen on his deathbed that he'll order Solomon to kill Joab and a couple of others as well. So there's no question that David is a murderer here, and there's no question that he's a liar. He's lied many times, repeatedly, whether to Saul or to the Philistines to try to pretend he's somebody else, and he plainly obfuscates, not making clear his intentions when we can tell as readers exactly what's going on. But now we're not sure, because this scene ends with the classic David's mourning, oh, Absalom, my son, Absalom. And we have to ask, is this real or not? And that may seem a challenge to say, oh my God, the man's son has just died, give him a moment to mourn. But David has let this scenario unfold, and plainly he put Joab and Abishai in charge of 2/3 of his army, knowing what violent men they were, knowing that Joab killed Abner, although David disclaimed personal responsibility for that. So he put those people in charge, along with Ittai the Gittite, who we know nothing about his violent ways or not. And we also know that David didn't talk to Absalom other than for a brief passing moment in 9 years, while Absalom was both breeding his resentment over the rape of his sister Tamar and planning the death of Amnon, which David did nothing about, and then Absalom going back to be with his grandfather in Geshur, and David does nothing about it. And it takes Joab coming to David to say, bring Absalom back, for David to even see Absalom for a moment. So we do have to balance out this momentary appearance, at least appearance, of a disconsolate father with all the evidence that suggests that David has let this happen, and this is just one more act to disclaim responsibility for it. And as my notes here has, this perhaps is all to please the Egyptian colonial overlords, who we haven't seen yet, but we will see very explicitly as the first thing that Solomon does as king is bring Pharaoh's daughter into his house, and we'll see other examples of the Egyptians being in control of the situation, or being the place where potential potential rebels go to wait their moment to rebel against the king in Jerusalem. So we'll explore that more later as we go. But that's certainly something that's at issue as we enter into this story. And so we're on the final scene of it here, on the purple scene here, as the message comes to David. Is it good tidings or not? We've also been looking at the whole range of characters, and I realize I've had this posted for a whole series of videos now, but there was one more character that I left out. I had the sentinel, but I didn't have the gatekeeper. So David has the sentinel and the gatekeeper watching with him, so we've included that there. And we also have this whole series of places, and now we're at the city gates of Mahanaim after the runners are returning from the forest of Ephraim where Absalom is dead. We also can look at the atlas to see where we are on the other side of the Jordan. We've been here in Mahanaim where David is waiting, and this is where the scene today takes place. So there's not a lot of scholarly details. There's not a lot of translation issues, and that's one reason I think I can go through this whole scene in one video. But there's a lot of drama. So I'll leave it on the right side of the screen, and we'll follow on the left when there are a few words that matter. But mostly it's a matter of the emotion and the drama of the scene here. So that my verse note just notes the chiasm that you see on the right side of the screen. We saw Ahimaaz earlier with Jonathan, Abiathar's son, as David left them in Jerusalem, and they became the vehicles for sending the messages between their fathers and David when he was at the ford of the Jordan, and they were still in Jerusalem. So Ahimaaz is now with him in Mahanaim. We don't know where Jonathan is, and he calls out, "Let me run and carry tidings." For some reason, he thinks that's going to be good news. The word for tidings here in the Hebrew is bashar here, and the Septuagint in the Greek, euangelio, which a New Testament reader would recognize as to bring good news. And there it is, literally, it's just a news, angelion, but you means good. So in the Septuagint, it's literally good news. In the Hebrew, it's more neutral. It's just tidings or news. And as my note below has, the word is used 7 times in 13 verses, and nowhere else in Hebrew Scripture. So it's a word that belongs specifically to this scene. So he says, "Let me run and carry tidings to the king." David is now the king again. "That Yahweh has delivered him from the power of his enemies." Making the theological judgment, and we have to decide, is Ahimaaz an effective theological interpreter of the situation or not? The word for delivered here literally is Yahweh is judged from the hand of his enemies, which makes the hand connection with Absalom's monument, which is the hand of Absalom, as you can see on the right side of the screen, as well as with the hand of his enemies that we see here. Not the power of his enemies, but the hand of his enemies. So Joab said to him, "You are not to carry tidings today. You may carry tidings another day." Literally, below this day is twice, contrasting with another day, bahom achar. So you may not carry tidings this day. You may carry tidings another day, but today you shall not do so. Notice a little a chiasm there. Because the king's son is dead. David referred to Absalom as the young man, the Na'ar Absalom, but now he's restored to his rightful title in death of the king's son. Then Joab said to a Cushite, and this comes out of nowhere. What do we know about Cushites? The only other Cushite in the Hebrew Bible is Moses' woman, or wife, in Numbers 12:1. Thus either Ethiopian or Nubian, black people just south of Egypt. But the question is, what is he doing here in the Transjordan with David on David's side? We've seen that David's side consists of a whole series of foreigners, and in chapter 19 and 20 we'll finally hear about something about elders of Judah. But there's nothing about Judahites anywhere in this, and we don't know if any of these people are related anyway other than the biological relation between the sons of Zeruiah and David that we saw earlier. But Cushites come out of nowhere, and so we don't know what he's doing there, and he has no name, and he's referred to, as you can see in the key words here, repeatedly simply as the Cushite. So Joab said to a Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." But we don't know what he's seen. Has he been there the whole time? Are they still standing by the heap or by the tree? We don't know exactly where they are. But he says, "Go tell the king what you've seen." The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. And that's so different than the message that we've seen earlier when David sent Uriah with a written message to take to Joab. Joab just assumes the Cushite will bring the message that he wants. Well, what message does Joab exactly want him to bring? But Joab doesn't shape it in any way at all. He just leaves it to the Cushite to say whatever he chooses to say. And Joab must be figuring if the Cushite guesses wrong, it's his life, not mine. But we'll see. The Cushite could well say that Joab did it, although we saw that Joab stabbed him but was not responsible for the death. But maybe that's a legal distinction for our environment and not for theirs. But in either event, it doesn't come up. Then Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite." Perhaps he's recognizing that Joab was trying to protect him from the king taking out his sadness on the messenger, as he did on the Amalekite, who brought the word about Saul's death at the very beginning of 2 Samuel. We don't know whether Joab has a particular reason to want to save Ahimaaz, and we don't know what Joab's relationship with Zadok is, although we'll find out at the succession in just a few chapters. And Joab said, "Why will you run, my son?" Isn't that interesting that suddenly everybody's a son? It's certainly a theme throughout these chapters, though, the son Absalom, of course. Seeing you have no reward or literally nothing to obtain for the tidings. In other words, what's in it for you? If you tell them that his son is dead, he's obviously not going to be happy. That's the truth. If you don't tell him the truth, why do you want to run at all? So there seems to be no good reason for Ahimaaz to want to do this, and Joab obviously doesn't mind whatever consequences falling on the Cushite. And he says, "Come what may, I will run." So he said to him, "Okay, run." And it's doubled there. So if you're going to run, run. So Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. We assume that running by way of the plain is coming from the forest, which was up here somewhere, down, not through the forest, but down here to Mahanaim. Ahimaaz and outran the Cushite. So let's go down the screen a little bit so we can see some more of our passage. So David was sitting between the two gates, and that's an interesting place for him, as Alter notes that David's ambivalence about the armed struggle is spatially figured by its physical location. His between the gates matches Absalom's between heaven and earth, and also contrasts with Eli at the gate from which he falls at the very beginning of 1 Samuel in chapter 4. But he sits while Absalom took a stand earlier. So he's sitting between the gates, and the sentinel went up on the roof of the gate by the wall. And so if you can picture that, there's the two gates, and the sentinel has the higher view up on the roof reminding us of David being on the roof and watching Bathsheba, which began this whole chunk of the story. When he looked up, he saw a man running alone. And the sentinel shouted and told the king, we don't know how, they don't seem very far apart. If he's just on the roof and David's between the two gates, it shouldn't be very far. But the text notes that he's shouting. And the king said, "If he is alone, there are tidings in his mouth." Why draw that conclusion? Why not draw the conclusion if there are several people, why would they not be coming together with tidings? The soulness of the runner doesn't seem to give an obvious reason why the assumption is made that there are tidings in his mouth, but that's what he says. And he kept coming and drew near, and he went literally. And notice how the writer is just drawing this whole business out in great detail, especially for an overall biblical text that provides so little detail, that this scene is so spread out. The whole war is said in a couple of verses with no detail at all, and here we have this. Then the sentinel saw another man running, and of course we know who that is. The camera is turned all the way around, so we know it's Ahimaaz first and then the Cushite, but they don't know that. And the sentinel called to the gatekeeper. Is that because his shouting wasn't getting to David? He was concerned that the message had to be relayed? Or is it because he's concerned about the king's response? And that's why a note below suggests. The gatekeeper, Ahasuerus, is only here in Samuel a couple of times in 2 Kings. And see another man running alone. And the king said, "He is also bringing tidings." So now the king sees two men running. Does he assume they're bringing different tidings? Why would there be two men running to bring him a message? Can he assume the first one is bringing a message and the second one is bringing a correction or an addition? We just don't know. But the sentinel continues, "I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok," which begs the obvious question, how does he know what the running of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok looks like? How much practice is there in seeing particular people running so from a distance he could recognize the style of running? And is this sentinel local in Mahanaim, or is this a member of David's community who he's brought all the way from Jerusalem, and they just happen to be sitting on the tower of the gate of this city that isn't their city? What about the people of Mahanaim? We hear nothing about that this whole time. So many things that are strange in the midst of a story that says so much without saying that much at all. And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good tidings." And as Falkman notes below, this double talk and the good man, good news logic, which is a descent into magic, reveal that David is feverishly engaged in self-deception. But we have to wonder what good man means. Is that what we hear from some politicians today, that being good simply means you're on my side, and if you're not on my side, that makes you a bad person? We certainly see that kind of personal politics, and that's not unique to our time period. So it may well be that Ahimaaz is one of ours, his father is one of my people. I can trust that he'll bring good news. But just because he'll bring honest news doesn't mean that the news that actually happens is good, does it? Of course not. But David is, as Falcon would suggest, just trying to fool himself into hoping beyond hope. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, now skipping the gatekeeper, all is well, literally shalom. First of 3 shaloms in these verses here. And as Falcon notes, the messengers and the king have shalom as an apparent meeting point. Both have a strong compulsion for it. One calls it out, and the other urgently inquires after it. The king wants what the messenger will gladly give him, and yet they do not reach one another. Their contact is but show, and they talk through one another. And isn't that the case? So we'll see. So he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground, as we've seen other people do, including Absalom and Joab, and said, "Blessed be Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." Which is to say, he didn't answer the question, because we know, and he must know, as Joab knows, all he's concerned about is Absalom. So this blessed is Yahweh who delivered up the men who raised their hand. Notice the plural of the men, not just Absalom, and that's what's at issue against my lord the king. And the king simply repeats it. Is it shalom? Or I've said it for the first time here. I'll repeat it in a minute. He repeats the shalom. Is it shalom with the young man Absalom? Still with the young man. Not the king's son, not my enemy, not the rebel, with the Na'ar Absalom. Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent your servant, I saw great tumult, but I did not know what it was." In other words, he chickened out. Maybe that's a good thing rather than giving the true answer, but given how much he insisted on running, the fact that he chickens out at the end tells us something about the character of Ahimaaz, but it's quite a dramatic element to put into the scene. To build up the don't go, okay, go. When he goes, he doesn't do it, and the culminating moment will have to come from the mouth of the Cushite to David. So the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." In other words, rather obviously, if you can't answer the one question I care about, get out of the way. And that standing there echoes what we saw in 18:13. We can go back to that just for a moment to see the standing. I would have stood aloof, the one who objected to Joab's command to kill him in exchange for a reward. So he turned aside and stood still. And then the Cushite comes. And notice the parallel with the announcement of Uriah's death back in 11:21 and follows, which you can look at there, when this was the message that was sent. And we heard that specific message sent with David to Joab, so that Joab would not feel bad about people dying there. Or that's the message coming back, the messenger from Joab back to David saying that. So that was the message of David, and here's another one, but that was directly from Joab, and this is from the Cushite. Notice that Joab could have given the Cushite written directions or put words in his mouth, but he didn't. So the Cushite can't honestly say, "Joab told me to say," but he could tell it dishonestly under pressure since Joab's not there, but that's not what happens. And the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good tidings for my lord the king," making that judgment for himself. "For Yahweh has vindicated you this day, or judged for you." Recalling 7:11, where Nathan's narrative of Yahweh appointing judges, not kings. And then 15:4 is Absalom, "If only I had been a judge." So Yahweh is the judge here, according to the Cushite, delivering you from the power of all those who rose against you, or literally from the hand, as we see down here, the hand of your enemy. But all the king wants to know is it shalom with the young man Absalom, it completely ignoring all this other business. And the Cushite answered, refusing to answer it directly, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm, or literally to do you evil, be like that young man." So he's saying it, but without saying it. He doesn't say that he's dead. He certainly doesn't say who killed him. He may or may not know who killed him. And interestingly, Job told him to report what he saw, and none of this is reported as what I saw. It's simply a judgment, a theological judgment on vindication, and a judgment here about in the future, may your enemies be like what has already happened to that young man. So he never hears it directly, but that's enough to generate what follows here. The king was deeply moved, or more importantly, shaken. It's not so much moved as much as a physical thing. The word unpronounceable without the vowels here, shaken, literally applies to earthquakes in other places. There's physical shaking, not an emotion, but a powerful shaking. So the king is shaken there, as we see down here, and went up to the chamber over the gate. Aliyah, here only here in Samuel, but 20 times in the Masoretic text, obviously to be alone, and wept. But he's alone up there, but he must be crying out loud enough that somebody can hear him. And we'll look at that next time. But we can certainly hear him, but we know already in advance that other people can hear him, despite his isolation in the chamber over the gate. And he went and said, Vakoamar, the messenger formula, otherwise, usually from somebody important, not just a personal speech, linking all these situations at 12:7, 16:7, and 19:1. In each situation, the person is isolated from the others. Let's look at those real quickly. In 12:7, Nathan says to David, "You are the man." And in 16:7, as we saw here, Shammai shouted, man of blood and man of Belial. So here it comes with a very different kind of judgment. My son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Some scholars suggest that the poignancy of this really implies that it's real and not political. But as my note below, as cynical as it may sound, we must ask, is it real or is it a performance to allow for plausible deniability? For all the reasons I said at the beginning. Maybe it's both. Maybe he truly is sad for his son Absalom, but recognized this is what had to happen, but he'll never take responsibility for it, and in the end it's Joab who will die. We'll continue with the story as the word comes to Joab next time. See you then. Bye-bye.